Thank you, Andre. And I would start with thanking the organizing for inviting me. It's kind of honor to be one of the rare experimentalists in this place giving a talk. And here I feel actually confident to admit that I used to be a theorist a long time ago. But then I decided to kind of go a different route, and I enjoyed the talks before. So I will first start by acknowledging that all the experiments that I will show you were done by my former PhD students, Hyunjun Kim, who now moved to Cornell, and Youngjun Choi, who, after finishing at Caltech, went to Andrea Young's lab, and then now he's a professor at Cornell. And over the years, we actually had beautiful collaborations with many theorists. Unfortunately, they left many questions unanswered. So if you're interested in kind of tackling some of these questions, there's a slot for this slide here that I can kind of enlarge the list. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining the twisted bilayer graphene. There were talks before it. Everything started in 2018, where the flat blends were detected, and signatures of correlated insulators and superconductors were observed for the first time. And soon after, it was realized that twisted bilayer graphene is not the only material that gives you this type of bands and gives you the superconductivity. And there are originally straightforward extensions to this system, where instead of just using 2 layers, you can use 3 layers, where nominally first and the third layer are untwisted, so the relative orientation is 0. And then the second layer is just relatively twisted for some angle theta. And if you fix this theta correctly, you will get a non-interacting band structure that reminds you of what you get for the twisted bilayer graphene. Essentially, you will get a set of flat bands. But in addition, you will have this Dirac cone that, depending on the experiments that you do, may or may not show up in the data. Okay. So for this talk, you can just remember the twisted trilayer graphene is kind of very much connected to twisted bilayer graphene for this reason, and you can actually extend this going more than 3 layers. You can go to 4 layers and 5 layers, and this was done some years ago, both at MIT and in our own lab. And what I want to kind of highlight here, since it's a conference on superconductivity, and this meeting is about superconductivity, that all these structures are superconducting. They show robust superconductivity with roughly same TC, but in a kind of a larger phase space of parameters. And if I go a step further, I can just say, why would you study these? Why would you go beyond TBG? You can have various personal reasons to do it, but experimentally, there are 2 things that happen when going to multi-layers. One is that yield of superconducting devices is extremely high. And just to kind of give you perspective, we had a conference just before this one in Princeton, and Dima Fetov, the group that kind of produced one of the cleanest devices there, they said that their yield over many years of development for the twisted bilayer graphene is about 25 to 30% maybe. So every third or fourth device that you make and painfully stack is superconducting, even you do everything right. And in contrast, all these devices that if you go beyond, if you go 3, 4, or 5 layers, the yield is nearly 100%. So essentially, you could imagine that you can, because you're stacking more layers, there's more room for errors in terms of twist angle and things like that. But the thing is that somehow the system is more resilient to these errors. And overall disorder seems to be kind of less either less in a sample or less relevant for transport measurements. Okay, so for this reason, we focused on the simplest of this family, twisted trilayer graphene, and for the most part, the things I'm going to talk about today are covered in these 3 papers. So first, I will kind of give you some introduction to TTG, what we see, some kind of features of gaps that we see close to filling factor of 2 to 3. And then I will kind of give you some updates as we kind of improve the sample quality in this system. So if you just take a picture of a twisted trilayer graphene, you do the STM studies, so you essentially approach with a metal tip, you scan over the sample, you have a gate underneath that you can use to tune the density of electrons, and if you do kind of a generic scan, you can see that in most area of the sample, you have this kind of triangular lattice of bright dots. These bright dots correspond to what in TBG would be AA sites. And occasionally, you see some kind of a defect that can be understood by various means, but you can think of them as some kind of dislocations or something that originates from, like, let's say, your first and the third layer being not perfectly aligned in this system. So it's kind of important to note that nature really gives you this for free. So nature prefers that the first and the third layer are aligned. So if you actually take the density of states calculations for 2 particular, let's say, stacking, here's the example, A twist A stacking, where the first and the third layer are perfectly aligned, meaning the carbon atoms are on top of each other in the first and the third layer. So these are the blue and the black dots. In this picture, you don't see the black dots because they're underneath the blue dots. But here, if you would have like some kind of a shift, a relative shift, what you would see in the density of states is a completely different symmetry. So the fact that in the experiment, you see this kind of triagonal lattice tells you that this is a predominant orientation of the dominant configuration of the atoms in the TTG. And this was kind of confirmed that actually there is atomic reconstruction that favors this particular configuration. Okay? And now if you want to go further and simulate this kind of, let's say, defects, you can probably do it in different ways. But even if you assume that there is some sort of, let's say, one lattice mismatch between the first and the third layer, just kind of offset, you would get something similar to what is seen in the experiment. Okay? So we are, at this point, even a few years ago, we were kind of convinced that, okay, structurally we understand this system really well. So now if you go to spectroscopy, the spectroscopy of this system looks actually very rich. So you have, so on the y-axis here is a gate voltage. You control the density of electrons. On the x-axis is your bias. That's the energy of electrons that you are kind of either putting into the TBG or pulling out of TBG. And what you see here is that you have if you go from the filling factor of, very positive filling factor, your flat bands are way below the Fermi level. And then as you dope, the flat bands enter close to the Fermi level, then there is like rich interplay of phases. And let's say, reconstruction of the bands happening, and then eventually you kind of exit, and the flat bands become placed above the Fermi level. And this picture here is actually very similar to what was seen in previous results on TBG, both for our group and the group of Yali Yazdani at Princeton. And the main difference between these plots and this particular plot is a twist angle, which was kind of expected just from theory. So essentially, if you want to recreate these flat bands in non-interacting picture, you have to rotate the layers by an angle which is square root of 2 larger than in twisted bilayer case. So here, the magic angle is around, between 1 and 1.1 degree, and here it's about 1.5 degrees, okay? So now you can see many features here, especially at the Fermi level where the transport is kind of the most sensitive, and you can ask all kinds of questions, like where particular resonances occur from, and what is the origin of observed gaps. So here's an example of a gap, and what is the ground state of the system at various temperatures, okay? So originally we first focused on studying the gaps close to -2, and in this particular region you see the gap. You can kind of directly see that this gap kind of originates from some kind of a resonance that splits in a complicated way here, and then splits more symmetrically as you dope the system. And if you take particle line cuts, this is kind of all data, you can actually extract something that is symmetric around the Fermi energy and looks kind of like a superconducting gap. And we actually observed that there is even a transition that if you're close to this filling factor of 2, let's say if you're in the range of like the filling of -2.2 electrons or 2.2 holes per Moiré site, you get something that looks like we call it U shape, and something that is kind of much weaker near the Fermi gap that is kind of a little bit suppressed here near the zero bias, which we call the V-shaped gap, okay? And you can do all kinds of fitting. Originally we could do, if you want, you can fit a nodal gap here and extract some parameters. So in addition to these types of measurements, you can actually do additional measurements to convince yourself that what you see is, or the gaps that you see are actually related to superconductivity. And for that, what you need to do is, so all these measurements are done when the tip is relatively far away from the sample, where you just have a tunneling of individual electrons. But what happens if you push the tip into the sample more, if you reduce, let's say, tip sample distance such that resistance between the tip and the sample is of the order of E squared over h, a few tens of kiloohms, you get something which is kind of well known. This is an Andreev reflection. You're expecting to see Andreev reflection signal, which would result into every time when you shoot an electron in the kind of superconductor, you would have a hole reflecting back, and this would correspond to enhanced signal at zero bias. Okay, and this is exactly what we see here. Here are some examples. Here's an example here. So this kind of more red means more conductance, and we see it in exactly the same range as you would expect from this gap. And this was also seen by Ali's group in TPG roughly at the same time. And you can do actually more controlled experiments. You can actually raise the temperature, see how this peak disappears. It disappears around something below 1 Kelvin, which is expected. You can apply out-of-plane magnetic field, and you suppress it at 1 Tesla. It's suppressed. If you apply in-plane magnetic field, it stays. And this is all consistent with what you expect from the superconductivity, and it's consistent with all the data around. Yes?
What was TC from resistance?
It depends from a sample to sample, but roughly 1 to 2 Kelvin. All of these systems are roughly 1 to 2 Kelvin. I mean, you can go lower, but it's hard to go higher. Okay. We couldn't kill it in our lab because we are limited to like 1.52 Tesla. So there it kind of, it just doesn't work. Yeah. Okay, so, and if you can see, I mean, I'm showing this kind of image again. This is this kind of U to V transition, which was kind of interesting at the time. There is an increase in the density of states at zero bias. And there is actually many mysteries originally surrounding this gap. And the biggest of them is that this gap wouldn't get suppressed if you apply out-of-plane magnetic field. So you remember, the Andreev signal drops to 0 when you apply like 1 Tesla, but your gap just kind of smoothly, changes its shapes. And around 1 Tesla, you can see that there's no more coherence peak, but the gap kind of persists. So there's nothing happening there. And it doesn't make sense to go to higher fields, because at higher fields you actually get all kinds of Landau level physics that kind of complicates things more. So the mystery at the time is that this gap that is observed is too big. I didn't really put the values. What is the gap divided by KBT? You can do it. There was a question? Oh, yes.
Maybe you're going to answer it here, but it looked like your Andreev reflection had roughly the same energy scale as this.
Smaller. I will address it. I will address it in the future. It's smaller by the factor of, like, depending on where you look, by a factor 2 to 3. Okay? Yeah. So the gap is too big. It's too big for TC, for transport TC. It's too big to Andreev reflection. It's compared to TC from Andreev reflection, and it survives this kind of increasing magnetic field. Yes?
Lack of particle-hole symmetry for these DI-dV curves generally considered an artifact, or it contains something more?
I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question, but I can tell you the particle-hole asymmetry is present everywhere, meaningly in STM data, in transport data, in all kinds of data. So there is no general kind of consensus that you would expect particle-hole symmetry unless you do very simple modeling. Okay? So the fact, I mean, this is also kind of seen in many unconventional superconductors. You see that there is like a huge particle-hole asymmetry in that set. Okay? So essentially, yeah, everything is kind of a little bit confusing. And at the time, kind of practical experimental thing, if you see a gap, it's related to superconductivity, but it's not like really kind of checks all the boxes that you want to check, you kind of name it pseudo gap, and then you kind of resolve or you postpone your problems for some years. Okay. So this is a part of this story, but actually what happens in this system is actually much richer. And I want to shift gears now and tell you about a different order that also occurs in this twisted trilayer graphene for the roughly, in the roughly the same range of filling factors. Okay? And for that, we need to actually switch from this kind of a spectroscopic view to just kind of a real space imaging that STM is kind of good for. And I just want to kind of show you some examples of what I mean by that. So now we are focusing on a much smaller length scale, where you can see this is like a topography of one of these, we call it AAA sites, where the, with bright spots in this Moiré pattern. And if you actually look at the specific energy, you can see some kind of atomic structure. But on top of the atomic structure, you can actually see some kind of a pattern emerging in this density of states. And this is a kind of maybe a clearer image where you can see this particular pattern also changes as you change the bias. So this is slightly negative bias, slightly taking data slightly below the Fermi energy, slightly above the Fermi energy. You can see the bright and the dark spots kind of invert the contrast. And there is something that happens here, and essentially this if you kind of want to assign a Q vector corresponding to this change, this is kind of known in the field as square root 3 by square root 3, or Kekulé reconstruction, where now you actually, in the momentum space, you have a folding of the Brillouin zone, but essentially what you see here is that you have this kind of reconstruction where not all of these hexagons coming from the STM image are the same. And the way to see this clearly is actually just to take this image, you do Fourier transform, and then you can actually extract the periodicities that you see, and you can see that there is a central peak, there is a there are peaks, bunch of peaks that correspond to your periodicity originating from the graphene lattice. But then there is this kind of a peaks closer to the origin where they would correspond exactly to this square root 3 by square root 3 reconstruction. Okay. And what's kind of peculiar about this reconstruction that is actually gate dependent. So essentially you only see it in these regions where you are near half filling of the electrons or holes. So if you park at charge neutrality, or you park your voltage far deep into the other bands, you don't see that. So it's something that is related to this kind of correlated states that emerge. And just to kind of give you some perspective of intensity, you can plot the ratio between this Kekulé intensity versus graphene intensity, and you can actually see, the details depend a little bit on at which bias voltage you use, positive or negative, but it kind of peaks here at roughly minus 2.5 and something around plus 2.5, and it's kind of suppressed for most of the other gate voltages. So what's kind of interesting about this reconstruction, and I'll kind of mention this also later, one thing just to kind of link it to that gap, and this will be kind of relevant for later, but both these gaps and this Kekulé reconstruction are suppressed around, by 10 Kelvin they are suppressed. Depending on where you measure, it can be between 5 and 7 Kelvin. Depends on the position of the samples, and we actually have a lot of samples and many more areas where we saw this. So this is pretty generic observation. Yes.
Do you ever see intervalley scattering, regular intervalley scattering? So there's a drug one, so intervalley scattering will give you the same.
Yes. So if we have some sort of an impurity, you will see similar pattern, but it will not be a gate dependent pattern.
But
so
without impurities, you never see intervalley scattering.
we don't see it in all of these kind of images. Yeah, there's no. It's not there. I'm not entirely sure what.
Because we see intervalley scattering everywhere.
Oh,
So I'm just curious.
but is it like a dependent?
Twisted bilayer, monolayer.
Okay.
Monolayer, yes, but twisted.
Yeah, even twisted bilayer.
With the Fermi level in the back.
Well, he says everywhere, so it's in the band, out of band, so it's everywhere. Okay, but it's good. No, no, this is kind of pretty generic, and we see it only in these regions. Okay. And the point I want to make, this is kind of the connection to theory. There was actually theory predictions that preceded this work. One of them is from the speaker from yesterday. And I will kind of, there are many actually candidate states that can give you this. So essentially, there are three main candidates which were in TBG, and we, at least at the time, thought that, this is relevant for TTG as well. So these are the kind of the acronyms from them, like KIVC, TIVC, and IKS. So the KIVC as a state is actually very easy to rule out, at least in our sample, because it's not expected to have this type of signal at B equals 0. It's expected to have signal, but only at high magnetic fields. So we could kind of rule this out immediately. But then there's like two different states that it's kind of a little bit harder to distinguish. One is this kind of time inversal symmetric intervally coherent state, which has this kind of translational symmetry on Moiré scale. So if you go from one Moiré site to another Moiré site, you should see kind of exactly the same Kekulé reconstruction, or you can see something that slowly evolves from one site to another, and somebody named this incommensurate Kekulé spiral state. Okay. And in order to distinguish which one of these is actually happening, you need to kind of scan a little bit larger areas, and you have to kind of improve your sample quality somewhat. And I will just go very quickly through this slide because it's probably not interested for any of the theorists, but experimentalists might find it somewhat interesting. So there's many ways how to make these kind of TTG samples, but essentially what you do is you have some polymer on which you put some more stickier polymer, and then you kind of pick up all these kind of, let's say, layers. You need to pick up a gate, you need to pick up your dielectric, and you kind of make this twisted trilayer graphene on top by twisting 3 consecutive layers of graphene. But then you actually, when you do STM, you need to figure out how to put this onto some kind of a substrate that is not a polymer. And the way how we did it before, we would just stick it onto some other polymer, and then we would flip, so and kind of released it. But one of the improvements in kind of trying to make this large samples that are sufficiently clear is now, because we always suffer from polymer residues, is to use actually thin layer of gold, and then you kind of drop things onto the gold, and then when you flip it, actually you can kind of find that these areas are much cleaner than they would be if we did not use the gold. And there's other kind of extensions to this trick to kind of improve the sample quality. And I will just now shine you one of these images, which is much larger length scale. So this is a map which is roughly 0.5 micron by 0.5 micron, obtained with STM. And you can see, you have kind of various regions here. But what's actually kind of hard to see, that you have these kind of lines that would correspond to these, let's say, these locations that I was mentioning. And if you convert this to like a local twist angle, so you can actually take each of these points and recalculate what's the twist angle at each point, you kind of get this map. So you can see that twist angle is somewhat, is uniform in this particular region, but as you go across these locations, the twist angle can produce all kinds of gradients and all kinds of strains. So what's important to note that is in these kind of later measurements and the measurements that I'm gonna tell you in the rest of the talk, we actually focus now on these regions where you would kind of be somewhat more homogeneous twist angle, kind of reduce the twist angle disorder, and far away from these, let's say, regions where you have these locations, okay? This is kind of relevant for some of the data I'm gonna show you afterwards. So now if you zoom in somewhere here in this particular region, you can actually pull out the same trick as we did before. So you can take a large area of, let's say now, some tens of nanometers, where you can actually atomically resolve each of these sites. And now if you do Fourier image of this picture, instead of having peaks that would correspond to graphene lattice and to this kind of reconstruction, you actually get a collection of peaks. And this, you essentially get more resolution in K-space. And you immediately observe, let's say, additional periodicity. And this periodicity with this, let's say, between the small dots actually comes from this Moiré length scale, okay? So now each of these images is kind of converted into, like, let's say, selection of the dots. And now I'm going to skip some details, but what we can do, actually, based on the analysis of these kind of peaks, is that we can, and higher order peaks that happen, like, for example, here and beyond, you can actually calculate the where the real graphene peaks kind of reside. And then you can use these real graphene peaks, which are the peaks that correspond to graphene atoms periodicity, calculate where this square root 3 or square root 3 reconstruction would sit in the momentum space. And what we find is that actually there is some small deviation between the two. So what is calculated and where we actually find the closest peak is slightly offsetted. And this is actually what is expected from this incommensurate calculus spiral ground state. Yes?
Do you know why there's this extra texture to each of these peaks, this kind of mesh?
Yeah, the mesh comes from the Moiré periodicity.
Oh,
So-
that's the Moiré. Okay.
Yeah, that's the Moiré. So the separation between these dots
This kind of, okay.
is
That's the extra.
kind of inversely proportional to like the distance
Okay.
between the Moiré sites. Yes. So now you can kind of you can do this for many different areas. You can do this for many different parameters, and I just kind of have a summary graph for everything. This is as a function of doping, as a function of magnetic field. We tried to do this also on many areas of the samples. And what we found, I mean, I don't have a summary on a slide, but the idea is that this is mostly set, actually direction of this is mostly set by strain direction. You still have strain in these samples. And the point is that, you know, if you choose a doping or magnetic field, these things will kind of shift a little bit back and forth, okay? So if I just summarize this part of the talk, it's essentially both the regions where we saw previously superconductors and insulators, they show this kind of intervalley coherence or kind of some kind of a scattering there. Data is consistent with this kind of IKS, and as I mentioned, strain plays an important role because there are actually theory calculations that this incommensurate calculus spiral would only occur when you have a finite strain, and if you have zero strain, some other ground state might be at lower energies, okay? So now, knowing this and knowing mostly kind of addressing this kind of improved samples, I can kind of go back and try to revisit some of these spectroscopic features that I showed you in the first part of the talk, where essentially we said that, okay, there are some gaps that look like the superconducting gaps, and there are some various kind of mysteries with these gaps. So now we can actually kind of try to take new data on this and try to kind of see if there is some reconciliation on these mysteries and whether we can kind of build with some kind of consistent picture. And actually, we had the data for some time, but it took a long time to find theorists who would kind of help us at least explain how to kind of reconcile everything that we see. And what we kind of see here, I'm just showing you all of this old data, is that if you go from, let's say, charge neutrality to this kind of filling factor, let's say 4 or 3 here, you actually see that there is, for the most part of this phase diagram, you have a peak that is very close to the Fermi level. And then this peak somehow evolves into this kind of a gapped structure and then kind of merges back into some kind of peak. So essentially you have, for the most part, you have a lot of density of states near 0. Then you have regions where things are gapped. Then you have, again, regions where there's a lot of density of states near 0. And one thing which I can tell you here from the theorist point, this is not what you actually see if you do simple Hartree-Fock calculations. You don't see these things in a simple Hartree-Fock, but you see them when you start including dynamical correlations. So if you go beyond Hartree-Fock, including the dynamical correlations, this is data from Andre and collaborators. You see these peaks actually kind of are prominent at 0 energy. This is done without enforcing any particular order on this kind of a ground state. And it's slightly not depending on which theory you choose. Here's an example from Lena Bascone's group, where, I mean, she also sees kind of these peaks near the 0 density of states, and there could be like all kinds of details that are different. But essentially, there is something to say that, you know, if you go beyond Hartree-Fock, you get this kind of resonances close to 0 fairly naturally, regardless of which particular model you take. So now you can actually do this was for TBG, this is for TTG. You can kind of study this as a function of temperature, these peaks. One feature which we generally find is that these peaks around 0, they in general get suppressed with the temperature much faster than other features. So everything kind of gets weaker with the temperature, but these particular peaks are suppressed quicker. And let's say, at least theory suggests that this peak is something like remnant of condo-like peak, okay? So depending on which theorist precisely you ask, they would attach different names to this peak. So yes?
What are the dashed lines?
Oh, the dashed line, sorry, the dashed line is what would just a simple Fermi broadening do to this peak. So you take this 2 Kelvin peak and you broaden it as a function of temperature, and this is what you would expect to see, okay? And this is actually seen in TTG and TBG and other samples. If you look at Ali's data, probably it's somewhere there. So just nobody like really looked into this temperature dependence. And here are some more examples of this peak. You can, if you want, you can try to fit some kind of condo modeling on that, and it will give you some sort of a condo temperature corresponding to this peak. I don't know how much you should trust this kind of fitting, but at least it's kind of something that is giving you consistent temperatures of like, 10 to, let's say 7 to 13 Kelvin, depending on which area and which kind of filling factor you take, okay? And one of the upshots of let's say, having this association with this particular peak that comes from DMFT is that if you now impose an order to this DMFT peak in theory, let's say, you actually see that now, because your starting point is a peak close to Fermi energy, you actually very naturally get splitting that is also for at least a range of filling factors kind of positioned around the Fermi energy, okay, as well. So essentially, if you would do Hartree-Fock again, and you would impose some sort of intervalley coherence, you would get kind of a gaps, but these gaps would be somewhat like a semiconducting gaps, where they would shift and do all kinds of strange things as you change your doping. But here, because this is kind of starting point is a peak that is close to the Fermi energy, you get something that is split around the Fermi energy kind of in a natural way, okay? And now I just want to kind of reiterate this thing that I was kind of mentioning. So both this, let's say, calcular reconstruction, if you plot it as a function of temperature, and this kind of gap as a function of temperature, they both kind of disappear at roughly the same temperature scale. There's kind of a more analysis here as exactly how this peak disappears as it kind of fills up from the bottom, and how the coherence peak decays. But I'm happy to go into details if somebody asks. But the idea is that both of them show very characteristic similar temperature range. So it could be that at least part of this suppression that we see is actually coming from the IVC, and not all of it coming from the superconductivity, okay? And now I'm going to kind of show you more data on kind of focusing on this kind of gap here. And now the idea is that, I mean, kind of, maybe these gaps are kind of IVC related. And in this kind of newest data where we actually have highly homogeneous twist angles, what we see actually is that this is mostly the case. So essentially, now I'm focusing on a very small range of gate voltages. So -2 is somewhere here. So this is all happening between -2 and I'm sorry, I didn't label this, minus like I would say -2.4. And the idea is that in certain range of doping, so if you are here somewhere, you still see this one big gap, okay? And this is where this is superconducting as verified by Andreev reflection. I'll show you that. If you apply magnetic field, you don't see much. But then in this kind of a region where you're slightly below, slightly larger filling, you can actually resolve two different gaps. And one of them, the smaller one, actually disappears if you apply magnetic field. So at least, this thing here inside that you see inside, you can kind of attribute more confidently that that is your superconducting gap, okay? And by the way, this is similar to a recent paper from MIT, where they kind of saw in a more complicated planar spectroscopy geometry some kind of outer gaps in the inner gap here. And roughly, the numbers are similar, but they're highly gate dependent. So here's just a little bit more on this data as like 2D plots, where red here means high density of states, and this is how it's suppressed with the magnetic field. So essentially, these peaks here that you see at zero magnetic field get kind of squashed at 600 millitesla. And now you can compare, you can contrast this data with the data that you actually see from the Andreev reflection. And here are the examples of Andreev reflection in this little bit larger gate voltage range. What you see, you have a huge peak here, and then kind of, there's some signals here. And as you apply higher and higher magnetic field, you gradually suppress this Andreev reflection. And what you see, by the time you get to half a Tesla or 600 millitesla, everything is suppressed, okay? So if you want to be kind of a more consistent here, you can look at this. You can put these two things side by side and just kind of look what you see. The blue dots here are the outliers of this kind of a smaller gap, and the red ones are the outliers of this kind of just kind of peak identification of the larger gap. And you can see at least the Andreev signal follows closely the behavior of the small gap, okay, in this range of fillings, okay? So now what you can do, you can actually do a little bit more than this to try to convince yourself that the smaller gap is kind of a superconducting gap and the outer gap is something different. And for that purpose, you can actually, instead of going here where everything is kind of homogeneous, you can actually try to measure at these line defects and see what you see at there and see if there's any contrast. And I will just show you the kind of the main data for this. So here is the region where you can kind of recognize where there's some kind of funny things happening because of this defect. And if you measure, let's say from here on the let's say away from it, you actually see that close to this point where you are actually at this kind of a line defect, you see the small gap. And then as you go further away, you start seeing these signatures of the high gap. These kind of lines, very kind of sharp lines, these are actually atomic resolution images because you're kind of going across the atoms in some random directions. But you can, wherever you can kind of extract, you can see that the value of the smaller gap is roughly constant. So the smaller gap doesn't care if you are deep into the homogeneous region or you are close to the defect, while this larger gap does care and disappears near the defects. Another thing that we can try to do, and I'm almost done, is essentially you can do this kind of atomic imaging again, close to this kind of a line defect, and then you can do these tricks with, let's say, atomic, identifying the Kekule intensity versus atomic intensity of the Fourier peaks, and then you can actually see that close to this region, not only that the gap disappears, but also the signal this intensity signal, which is this kind of ratio between Fourier peak divided by graphene peak of calculi versus graphene, kind of also disappears at same point. So not only that we don't have a gap there, we also, for the same filling factor range, you also don't have like a calculus signal there as well. Oh, the outliers here are just kind of guides to the eye to help you. These are just the same height maps to identify where the AA sites. Yeah. I mean, there is a complicated, let's say, landscape of this ratio. And Ali had in his paper very complete analysis that you can have. You can kind of assign, some kind of order parameter to this reconstruction. Anyways, this is essentially where I want to finish. So what we are kind of sure by now that this some sort of an intervalley coherent state is a parent state of a superconductor, both superconductor and insulator. And the new things is that this state somehow descends from the Kondo-like resonance. And pseudo gap is somehow likely related to this intervalley coherent origin of some sorts. It's not clear if it's just the opening of a gap or there's something more complicated happening. And the hierarchy of correlated states, if you go if you go from highest temperature to the lowest, is like, okay, you have this kind of establishment of this Kondo-like resonance that kind of goes into this intervalley coherence and then goes into a superconductor. And with this, I would like to finish, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Hey, thanks for the very nice talk. So you say that this intervalley coherent state is this calculated reconstructed transition symmetry broken state, and then on top of it, the system develops superconductivity. So I would guess that presumably there is some sort of intertwining, and you will get a superconducting state that is modulated because of the modulated background. Can you extract the modulation of the superconducting gap that is somehow commensurate with the calculated construction?
Well, now we are going into territory of unpublished data. So, but the answer is yes.
Okay.
And I'll stop there.
Yeah, so if there is this induced higher density wave, basically.
Well,
You cannot answer.
so I mean, I answered.
Okay.
Stevan, very quickly.
Yeah.
Dependence of the slower gap. Do you have data for temperature dependence?
I believe so.
Does it close does it disappear at TC?
Yes.
And before that, it closes or fills in?
That we don't have. So it's kind of harder to get that particular data set. Mm-hmm. But if I recall correctly, we have some sampling points. I would say that everything that we see, mostly these features disappear. Meaning that the gap, there is no obvious closing of the gap that we can see. Mm-hmm. It's mostly that things gets kind of filled up.
I see.
I see more hands.
About the importance of strain. So you mentioned in Hartree-Fock it seemed to only happen with strain, but when you showed the incommensurate vectors, they all seemed along the gamma M line. Yeah. And if it was pinned to strain, I would not accept the crystalline direction.
Yes. So this was actually kind of confusing for us as well. So for the most part, we do see them at gamma M direction. There is some, when we talk to some of the theorists, they kind of said that this is not like somehow completely unexpected, okay? I'm happy to discuss more, but I kind of need to kind of remember the details of these discussions. But we do see actually areas where it's not along gamma M. So if you go to some kind of differently strained areas, you can also find points, let's say, where it's not along the gamma M direction. Okay, so this is unpublished data, but we did find such areas as well.
The superconductivity looks the same in all of these?
We didn't really check that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Say that the initial prediction and then subsequent work does put it likely on the gamma m, and then there's some softness, so it all matches.
Yes, but there is some. I think there's some, even from Harty-Fock, there is some argument that most likely it will be along the gamma m direction. Yeah. So I can refer you to this paper from MIT. They had this. I mean, it's on the archive. I think it's actually got published like yesterday or something, where they identify this kind of a small gap as a superconducting gap, and then the big gap is this kind of a bigger gap. So there is something there. So yeah, it seems that this is this is kind of a planar spectroscopy, so it's not really a transport, but it's a transport device that you kind of tunnel from. So the device geometry here is more complicated. They have a twisted trilayer graphene on top of twisted trilayer graphene, and then they tunnel from one twisted trilayer graphene into another twisted trilayer graphene. So that's why I'm saying it's a little bit more complicated geometry. But the data, at least the gap sizes, are roughly the same. The shape is different. That's correct. That is correct.
Commensurate structure, it's a unidirectional density wave, is that right? The wave vector is in one direction.
Yes.
And when you're talking about strain, are you talking about heterostrain or uniform strain?
So we can we are confident that we can extract the heterostrain, meaning the strain between different layers. So the way how you do this is you measure just the distances of Moiré pattern in different directions, which is slightly different. And actually, Abhay kind of worked out how to convert that into the heterostrain kind of a matrix.
Can you purposely apply uniform strain and maybe see if you can reorient?
We haven't tried that, mostly because it's difficult.
Am I allowed to grumble a little bit?
Yes.
So
Yes.
in your first paper and in Ali's paper, you guys showed us a gap. It looked very nice. It looked like the spectral weight was conserved just outside the gap, like a superconducting gap, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And then you said, by the way, we have this beautiful on-wave reflection thing, so don't go doubting us, right? And now you're telling, no, not really. The on-wave reflection was still there in your first data, and I'm sure that you worked hard to find the right gap, right?
Yes.
So why should I believe you now?
Okay. Good point. So in the first paper, no, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. So when you do this type of gap extraction, and when you do the gap extraction from, let's say, fitting Andreev reflection, okay, you get two different gap sizes, okay? And the resolution of that at the time, which is in a paper, is that you can say that what you see here is that's kind of this issue is unresolved, meaning that you have like a smaller gap and a larger gap, and then you call this pseudo gap, and then everything is at least internally consistent. But if I go back to the newest data, where I can actually.
No, I jumped in.
Okay.
Everything is not internally consistent. You measured the on-wave reflection there.
Yes.
How come it did not have a single particle signature in the spectrum? The single particle spectrum didn't show the second gap.
Oh, where's the you mean where's the data? Where is the gap in the?
So since you saw the on-wave reflection,
yes.
Didn't you have also seen the superconducting gap?
You can see it. Well, what you extract from Andreev reflection is the kind of you don't see necessarily, I mean, okay, there is a conversion step from Andreev reflection to the superconducting gap.
I understand, but there's a gap that you now say is due to superconductivity. So how come you didn't see this gap last time if you saw the Andreev reflection last time?
Oh, because you need a bigger, okay, so there are two answers to this, okay? So first of all, to resolve this gap, okay, you need the better quality data with a larger twist angle, with a less twist angle disorder. And I'm just looking at my presentation. I actually have a slide where in certain data sets, but only very few data sets, in the old data, you could see something that resembles this inner gap, but it's way more suppressed than here. I don't have it in the presentation. I had it in a different presentation, but I can show you this slide. But what I want to say is that if you go into this regime, which is deep into this kind of a U-shaped regime here, okay, you still see that the superconductivity and this kind of outer gap are on top of each other. That's one of the mystery that remains, and that's like, this is the part where I was saying, oh, this could be you as a theorist. The fact is that we suspect that the superconductivity is actually strongest here, where you essentially have what we think now it's this kind of outer gap on top of the inner gap. So if you can follow this kind of evolution okay, so here you have some kind of a gap, and then something splits off here. Something splits off here, and this is the range where I show this kind of nicely, kind of two gaps, okay? And then if you go beyond that, this gap continues to grow, and this gap is kind of, you cannot really see it. So that's where you only can see the outer gap. So essentially, you need to really focus in a small range of filling factors, and you have to focus on the highly homogeneous regions in the real space where you can actually resolve this. Otherwise, you don't resolve it. That's the thing. But Andreev reflection, because you have superconductivity everywhere, is much more robust than this gap.
I don't get that. If it's superconducting, it's superconducting. Why would Andreev reflection be more robust than the single particle gap?
Because there are definitely, like, okay. So because you have different states that will fill up this thing, and you will not be able to resolve it. So essentially, if you have two gaps on top of each other, you imagine that the gap, the coherence peaks are just much kind of lower in intensity. You will not see them on this background of the outer gap. That's the kind of, and we have actually data in on an older sample that we retroactively looked at, and you can see like just a kind of like a shoulder that would correspond to this energy scale.
Perhaps I'm grumbling too much.
No, that's okay.
No, grumbling is good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, the ball.
Yeah.
No, but I think at least now with this the data from Pablo is compaction very well. Comparatively to before.
Now you set me off again.
Go ahead.
If I look at the energy scale of this gap, I would say this is about 1 MeV.
Yeah, slightly smaller, but yeah, roughly. Yeah.
Well, that's very different from Pablo's gap.
Well, true. Here is like half MeV or maybe 400 micro eV. But the point is that I chose this point in this particular gate voltage. If I chose you this point here, I could definitely go to at least half a milli-electron volt. The point here is that he measures at much lower temperature than me, so he probably has a sharper features there. That's the difference.
Yeah, but a 1 MeV gap for a 1 Kelvin superconductor would be quite unusual.
No, it's still, yes. True, so there's still some discrepancy to go, which is another.
Okay, sorry.
Going back to the first slide,
you're responsible for
it's
that.
still kind of an issue. Yeah. No.
Say that the upper one corresponds to a kind of uniform superconductivity in a more weak coupling picture, and the lower one corresponds to something you see a pseudo gap and superconductivity, strongly correlated thing like underdoped cuprates. Okay, so naively you would expect then that somewhere in between there is going to be the highest TC. So when you look at the TC, do you see the optimization of TC somewhere in between, or
Yes.
basically when the pseudo gap disappears?
No, the optimization. So in transport data and also in our Andrea reflection, let me show you this picture. So roughly, this is essentially if you go from, let's say, this point. Sorry, this is a good set of data. So so here is where you start having superconductivity. Here's like what you see here. You have the largest Andreev reflection signal somewhere here, and actually as you see, these are the places where this kind of inner gap appears, and you can kind of still resolve it. You see that the Andreev reflection is also kind of getting suppressed.
Yeah, but what about TC?
We haven't looked at this extremely carefully in the TC limit, like essentially the cuts at the.
Yeah, so naive expectation is that TC is optimized in this.
But this is fully consistent with all the transport data. That it's actually essentially you see the optimal TC in this range between -2 to -2.4, which is roughly this range.
But do you also see the mode gap, mode phase eventually lower down? Is this proximity to a mode phase? The pseudo gap is usually proximity to a mode phase.
There is an insulating gap at 2 here, but it might.
But what about the other side?
On the other side, the gap is much weaker. Like if I show you even the old data, there might be some gaps kind of happening here, but they're much less developed. So the strongest gaps at TBG and TTG are always ±2. All the other gaps are kind of a little bit washed out.
Okay. Unfortunately, the real boss says we should stop now. So we stop now. Thank you.